When I was around 12, something became very, very obvious to me. And that was the fact that the way we were talking about climate change isn't really working for young folks. You see, climate change is one of those things that is terrifying to young adults, and even more so the younger you get. And the way that we currently talk about it for most people is as this apocalyptic event. But when it comes to actually taking effective action against climate change, we need better stories. We need better ways of talking about it, and more importantly than all of that, we need better ideas that can help empower individuals to approach it with new vitality, invigoration, and most importantly, effective action. So in today's video, I'm going to quickly go over 2 ideas that I think are absolutely critical to winning the fight over climate change and getting more people involved, especially young folks. Idea number 1 comes from Albert Camus, one of my favorite thinkers and philosophers. And the idea is that struggle, regardless of outcome, is good, is worthy, is beneficial. He wrote the book The Plague as a response to totalitarianism. The goal of the novel is really to showcase the fact that human existence in and of itself is a struggle. And because of that, we have to have a way that approaches struggle that both has community, camaraderie, and most importantly, vigor at its heart. We can't win everything. Especially when it comes to big disasters like climate change, there is a chance that even if you dedicated your entire life to it, we still might ultimately succumb as a species to it. But that's not a reason not to take action. If anything, that's more of a reason to take action. Struggle is worthy of fighting for. Resistance is an inherent good. It doesn't matter if your resistance ultimately fails against a wall and bulwark of totalitarian dictatorship or poor economic standings, or in the case of the characters in the book, a devastating plague that's still going to kill people. Going out of your way and making sure that you're part of the resistance and are helping someone is still ethical and it's still good. And we should never decide to not try to dedicate our lives to fighting climate change or any other existential risk because we believe that we can't solve it ourselves. Because of course we can't. But the message of the book is that we need to have camaraderie. We have to have a community of folks who are working together and have a collective struggle and bond out of that collective struggle and lean into the role as healers in a world that's so beset on making life incredibly challenging. And this extends far beyond just climate change. This extends far into the realm of just approaches to, reasons to exist and continue to live in existentialism. But it's particularly pertinent in cases of climate change and other existential risks. Existential risks inherently are about the disasters facing our species down that are going to carry the most weight for potential extinction of our entire species. Albert Camus' ideas about why we should still struggle despite not necessarily being able to win in every case connects really nicely to idea number 2, which comes from 20th century psychologist and Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was in Auschwitz in 1945. He was there for several years before that, and he was dying of typhoids on his what would have been a deathbed. But he writes in his book Man's Search for Meaning, which is one of the most profoundly impactful books I've ever read, highly recommend it, that what carried him through that moment of intense suffering is that he had a why. In that moment, his why was to find his family who he thought was still alive after the camp, after escaping the camp, and equally importantly to him at the time, finishing a book about the psychological traits of humanity. That was his why in that moment. And he scribbled down this final sort of dictation and this final version of the book that he really wanted to finish while he was sick with typhoids. And that is why he thinks he survived that moment. Because he had a reason to struggle through it. And I think it's very similar in the case of massive disasters like climate change, because taking action is not an easy thing to do. It is actually the exact opposite of easy. It's quite challenging. If you've ever tried to change the world, most people don't for a very good reason. It is hard as hell, which is why we need to find a sufficient why to overcome the difficulties of that. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher from the 19th century, wrote that man can overcome any obstacles if we just have a sufficient enough reason to do so. If there's a will, there's a way, is the classic interpretation of the quote. I strongly believe that that's true, and I strongly believe that's an idea that we have to integrate into how we look at climate change, as well as other global catastrophic risks. Because the way we currently talk about it breeds something called fatalism. The belief that despite how much you might try, we're just going to fail, and that therefore we shouldn't try at all. And obviously, I think at this point in the video, we can tell what Albert Camus would think of that idea, and also probably what Viktor Frankl would think of that as well. There's always a reason to struggle against bad. And that is something that we have to have stories and narratives and ways of talking about climate change and other risks that inspire us to pick up the fight and carry the weight that climate change places on all of our shoulders. Because if we don't have the right stories about climate change and the right ways of thinking about it and talking about how to stand up to the call to action, we're going to get crushed under the weight. Because climate change is inherently a terrifying prospect. And that terror oftentimes translates into otherwise incredibly decent, wonderful people who would hate it for anyone in their community to pass away or have their life damaged in any way whatsoever. It oftentimes translates into folks like that being at a place where they're like, yeah, maybe we deserve climate change. Maybe it's our fault. Maybe it's okay for it to happen. That's complete abstraction, complete disillusion. Because really what they're saying in that moment is that they're not desiring to pick up the fight. But what that really means is that they don't feel like they can. And I think that these ideas can help people pick up the fight and actually try harder and work to fight things that are potentially, probably disastrous for our species. Those two ideas help me reapproach climate change. They help me grow from a place of complete terror, complete utter shock and awe at the idea of climate change or other massive threats. I was terrified of the world ending when I was growing up. But recognizing that with a sufficiently strong community and with just the right ideas that we can garner from history, from philosophy, from psychology, from economics, from all the different wonderful fields, both scientific and humanitarian based, with those right ideas, we can approach these risks in a way that empowers us to take action and helps us live a more fulfilling life in the 21st century. So I think the most fulfilling life in the 21st century is going to be predicated inherently off of our approach to these massive ethical concerns of today. My goals with 21st Talks and this YouTube channel as a whole is to spread ideas that can help people stand up to the call to action that climate change, AI, and a ton of other existential threats put on our shoulders in the 21st century. And the first step there is getting the right ideas about ourselves as individuals, how we fit into the community at large and our local community by itself, as well as getting the right knowledge of these threats, having an actual look at the threats themselves. It requires all of that for us to properly stand up to the call to action that they place on our shoulders. Because moral responsibility is a really tricky thing we don't really talk about very much. But as Viktor Frankl pointed out in Man's Search for Meaning, responsibility empowers something to be more meaningful. Something's not meaningful because it's useless. Something's meaningful because you're participating in a role or a responsibility that is necessary and important. So obviously it would logically conclude from that point that if you're looking to live the most fulfilling life you can in the 21st century, the most meaningful life in the 21st century, there is a massive question there of climate change and artificial intelligence and biothreats and all these other massive potential issues that could have severe ramifications for our species. We have to ask ourselves as individuals how we individually, day to day, fit into that fight. Because we can't do all of it, but we should pick one. I strongly believe that through leaning into that fight with the ideas of Camus, Sartre, Nietzsche, and a load of other thinkers in addition to Viktor Frankl and Carl Jung, all these different thinkers that are typically abstracted from contemporary academia and not spread in a publicly accessible way, with their ideas, we can approach these risks with a new vitality that can inspire action more than take away from it. Because the current way we're talking about it inspires fatalism and pessimism. It makes people turn against their communities and what's actually in their own best interest. And I don't think there's anything that is more quintessentially tragic than that. I think these ideas can be the counter to tragedy. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Coleman. Check out our website, and I hope to catch you around next time.